Welcome back to Cornish Talks Common Sense. This is a show that talks about what is happening in our world today and tries to make sense of why it's happening. So we're going to talk about social issues that are in the public sphere from a perspective that is based on Judeo-Christian principles, which is the foundation of our Western civilization. It used to be taken for granted that way. Now that's coming under attack. And again, in future episodes, I'm going to talk more about that foundation and how it's moved astray. But I want to talk about a few particular topics, and we've just finished one that talked about the idea of critical race theory and what critical race theory means. It's an idea that is attributed to a couple of university professors, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw in particular, who developed a new way of thinking of how we should perceive history and looking at history through the lens of wrongdoing that's been done in the course of history, and predominantly it's an attack against what they've called white supremacy, which is the idea that persons who really have done much to found Western civilization as it has developed should be embarrassed and should be reproached for wrong conduct. And my viewpoint that I want to convey is that this critical race thinking is ill-conceived. It's not historically legitimate. It's falsely blaming and distorting history, and is causing division in our society today in a way that's going to cause fractures and problems for our society as we grapple with these issues. I want to move on from there and talk about another subject that has developed from the thinking of philosophers that largely came onto the scene in the 1950s and 60s. They were some of the people responsible, for example, the sexual revolution that occurred in the 1960s and 70s, the attacks against government in the United States, the Vietnam War protests, new ways of thinking that arose from postmodern thinkers, philosophers, starting really at the academic level and then filtering down to society at large, which is what has clearly been happening in our world today. So I want to talk about another subject that is controversial, as critical race theory is, and that's the subject matter of identity, personal identity, and particularly the one that's garnered the most attention in just the recent years, and that is the idea of gender identity. So where does the idea of gender identity come from? Where does the idea of gender come from? Well, I want to explain that gender identity is what we call a social construct. It's something that is created by philosophers, by people who espouse a viewpoint that is made up from scratch to distort what I've called historically Judeo-Christian foundational thinking, and is now casting that aside and is instead replacing it with humanist-based thinking that comes from human ideas. So many centuries ago, John Calvin came up with the phrase that the human mind is an idol factory. In other words, humans are good at elevating and making idols out of many things in our lives. For some people, it might be chasing after money, chasing after wealth. We all have a personal world view that each of us lives our life by. And we don't always understand it. Sometimes it's almost subconscious. But all of us have a world view that we govern our life by. So some of you may have heard, for example, of the idea of existentialism, a philosophy that often is credited to Jean-Paul Sartre and the French philosopher. And so existentialism is another way of thinking about life. And New Age philosophy. Some of you may have heard of the New Age philosophy that crept onto the scene a while ago. And so there's different worldviews out there of how we think. And so you have to understand that to see how ideas such as gender identity have come into existence. So gender identity, different from our sex, male, female, the binary idea that God created man and female. Instead, gender identity says that gender's fluid, that there is not just the two concepts of male and female, despite the fact that there are only two types of sex cells that exist, the X and the Y that we know about when we talk about chromosomes. Instead, gender identity says that gender is fluid, people can be other gender persuasions other than male or female. And of course, we know how much this has come to dominate the news in recent days. The idea of transgenderism, where we had the American college swimmer who was born a male but competing against females in swimming races at the university level, having adopted a transgender persona. And that has caused all kinds of commotion and controversy. So that's one example. There are many examples out there that we hear about in the news media every day. So where does this idea come from of gender identity? Well, let me explain, because this is the kind of history you won't hear about in the news media. This is the kind of reality of truth that you don't hear about in the news media. So I'm going to tell you about it. Where did gender identity come from? Largely, gender identity developed from two psychologists in particular. Their names are John Money and Robert Stoller. There's another doctor, psychiatrist named Benjamin, who we might also talk about, but I'm going to focus today on John Money and Robert Stoller. I have a couple books with me that they've written just to show you what I'm talking about. John Money was a Johns Hopkins professor, psychiatrist from New Zealand originally, who has had a powerful influence in creating this construct, this made-up perspective of gender identity. I have with me his book called Sexual Signatures on Being a Man or a Woman. And that is a book that he wrote back in 1975. Another book I have with me today is a book called Presentations of Gender by Dr. Robert Stoller. And each of these two psychiatrists have had a powerful influence in really creating gender identity. They created it. They made it up. Their viewpoints fed by psychiatric perspectives that certainly gave no value to Judeo-Christian principles that I've talked to you about, instead took psychiatry and medical field into a new area of thinking about how we talk about male and female. So they created the idea that there's more ways of perceiving sexes, male and female, than just those two. Instead, there are persons who can be transgender, who can be of other sexual persuasions. And you've heard many of these talked about in the media today, persons who are two-spirit, other words that have come out there to talk about this new idea, which basically amounts to how I'm feeling about myself. Now, remember I talked to you about the elevation of feelings as one of our core principles. And so the way that people perceive gender is based on how I feel about it at the moment. So, for example, I might say, well, I've got kind of a long neck, so I kind of feel like a giraffe today. So I want to identify as a giraffe. Now, you might say, well, that's silly. That doesn't make sense. And indeed, I'm going to suggest to you that gender identity does not make sense. It is a made-up concept deriving directly from the writings and theories of John Money and Robert Stoller. But let me tell you a little bit about where it's led to and things that many people don't know about John Money in particular. I have another book with me today. This book is called As Nature Made Him, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl. And it's a book written by author John Colapinto, who tells a story about the most famous case that basically built the career of John Money. So let me tell you a little bit about that story, because this is something you do not hear about in the news almost all anymore, because people who have this postmodern philosophy, who have a philosophy that supports gender identity, shuttle aside many of the truths and instead portray false narratives, false stories that are part of what postmodernism is. So let me tell you about the story of a Canadian young man named David Reimer. David Reimer was a twin. He was born to a Canadian family, husband and wife, and something very traumatic happened early in his life. Just after birth, in fact, David Reimer was being circumcised by a doctor who had delivered him and his twin brother. And the circumcision went horribly wrong. And as a result, his sexual organs, his penis was burned, and severely. And so his parents then had to consider, what do we do? And they approached medical personnel, and eventually his matter was recommended to a Johns Hopkins University professor named John Money. And so John Money then became the treating psychiatrist for David Reimer. And so what he recommended the family do was, in light of this misfortune that had happened to David Reimer, they said, raise him as a girl. Born a boy, had the traumatic occurrence after birth to his sexual organs, raise him as a girl. So they followed his advice, and they began to put him in a dress and in all manners to treat him as a girl. And John Money did sort of a semi-anonymous study and report on him, and he changed David's name. I believe it was Joan is what David became known as in the published research of John Money. And so David, with his changed name and his new persona of being a girl, was raised as a girl, and he was documented. His life was documented by John Money and others as he grew older. What is the end of the story for that case? David Reimer committed suicide. David Reimer killed himself directly as a result of his inability to function and to mentally cope with this new persona that had been thrust on him of living life as a girl. And the tragic story of David Reimer is recounted in John Colapinto's book, As Nature Made Him, which tells this story about John Money and how he devastated the life of David Reimer to the point where David Reimer ultimately committed suicide, as I've said. And I want to just take you to a couple passages in that book that I've highlighted to tell you a little bit more about the story of John Money and what he did in this case. So let me just read from a passage that John Colapinto writes. So this is talking about a occasion where John Money was speaking to an audience. And here are the words that Colapinto writes. He says, "The audience was then invited to ask questions. It was near the end of the segment that a young man asked the question that had been forming in Janet's mind. He asked about the other groups of sex patients whom Dr. Money treated, newborn babies with what Dr. Money had earlier called unfinished genitals, babies whose private parts were neither male nor female at birth. In replying to this question, Dr. Money explained that he and his colleagues at Johns Hopkins could, through surgery and hormone treatments, make such children into whichever sex seemed best, and that the child could be raised happily in that sex. The psychological sex in these circumstances, as Dr. Money put it, does not always agree with the genetic sex, nor with whether the sex glands are male or female." So there's the agenda, right there, stated in a few sentences as clearly as you can. There's psychological sex, how you feel about yourself, and genetic sex, male or female. And so what John Money was saying is, those don't have to agree. You can be born one way and change your gender to another. Well, what we found out from the case that John Money orchestrated is that it didn't work. And didn't work to the point where, as I've said, his subject, David Reimer, killed himself. It was a shocking result that at the time certainly cast John Money in a very, very poor light. And another psychiatrist, Dr. Diamond, Mickey Diamond, criticized John Money for his views. But what we see is that over time, John Money's views have come to dominate society. And we see that, right, with the influence today of transgenderism and the huge movement that has led into our modern society. It's important to understand the background, the derivation of where that came from and how that developed. And so this social construct, this made-up notion, attacks vulnerable people who have other comorbid issues in their life, depression and other issues, disorders, and those vulnerabilities have made people susceptible to questioning their sex and looking to new ways of expressing their gender based upon their feelings. And this is leading to devastating results in our society today. There is obviously huge debate about this subject. I can tell you that there is significant research published, for example, in The Economist magazine, published in university studies, that says that the majority of people who have been influenced this way by the social construct of transgenderism typically will outgrow that. And over 2/3 of people, as they get past their teenage formative years of life, will transition back to their birth sex. So that kind of information is not always made available to people, and people who argue to the contrary are very good at trying to promote other theories and other studies that frankly are generally not credible. I brought with me one story that I cut out from a newspaper a while ago that might be interesting just to touch on for a minute here today as we carry on this segment. I have an article that I'm going to just point to, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to point to it in just one moment. We're going to take a quick break so that I can have that article ready to go, and we'll be right back to talk about that. Welcome back. I'm Phil Cornish, and I'm your host of Cornish Talks Common Sense. We've been talking in our last segment about the social construct of gender, created out of whole cloth by a psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins named Dr. John Money, and also another that really was foundational in creating the idea of gender identity, and that's Dr. Robert Stoller. And last time I showed you their books. I've got them here again today. We have Sectional Signatures on Being a Man or a Woman by John Money, and Presentations of Gender by Dr. Robert Stoller. They are two of the founders of the idea of gender, which says that there are not just two birth genders, male and female, but there are other ways to display yourself by identity, and that idea has moved with overwhelming pace and become a juggernaut, a monolith in our society today, as you hear issues of transgenderism played out in the media almost on a daily basis. So I want to just finish up this idea. So scientists have studied the idea of gender, and there are studies that have indicated that the idea of how you feel about yourself in terms of gender is typically an emotionally driven, comorbid result, typically of other disorders such as depression. I have one article here from the World Health Organization talking just about that very fact, about how the comorbidity of depression is a significant factor in terms of gender adjustment by people. And of course, people often will get cause and effect mixed up. The correlation exists, and I think the strongest evidence is clear that persons who are having feelings of gender dysphoria is based on underlying conditions such as depression, and the evidence is very strong on that, although you certainly will get people from the other perspective who try to say otherwise. But you have to look at the credibility of the information and not allow yourself to be distorted by the thinking that has taken hold of those under the influence of Dr. John Money and the social constructionists of the theory of gender. So, for example, Dr. Lisa Littman of Brown University is one person who has studied this area extensively, and her studies have shown that about 2/3 of persons who at one point as a young child typically have identified as transgender, typically by the time their teen years are done, have reverted to their sex at birth. And so it's important to recognize that people who are influenced into the idea of gender dysphoria typically happen because of cultural and environmental influences on their lives. So we see how in society how memes, a word coined by Richard Dawkins, that says how people become influenced by trends or fads in our society. And this has been just increased exponentially by the growth of social media, TikTok and Facebook, and all of those influences have created gender doubts with people who then have doubts about identifying with their natural birth and instead are troubled by the idea that that's not the way they feel, and so their gender is something different. And this is a subject that is very serious, to the point where there are some doctors who will not even permit persons to be treated for what they would call gender conversion, and insist that people must be made to be happy and content in their life as identifying with a gender that is not their birth sex. And I've told you about the end result of David Reimer, the test study of, you will, the original test study that was done by Dr. John Money. David Reimer, who was raised as a girl despite the fact he was born a male when his sexual organs were damaged after birth. David Reimer committed suicide, and the outcome that occurred there tragically is something that was wholly promoted by Dr. John Money, who is wholly responsible for that outcome. And yet his way of thinking has now come to dominate in our society. And so we need to pull back the darkness that overwhelms this social construct and talk about the truth of what exists. And so in fact, we see now that there's huge controversy over whether efforts should be made to try to have persons who are feeling differently about their birth sex, that they ought not to be counseled to return to their birth sex. And there's huge controversy and contention over that. And it is doing damage to people, as people in the scientific community encourage people to be permitted to grow up in a sex in which they were not born. This is dangerous territory that we're embarking on. Some have fought to unveil the truth of the science behind it. Dr. Zucker is one doctor who has written and studied this extensively. I've mentioned Dr. Lisa Littman and some others who have raised the danger of what is happening with our young people, in particular with gender dysphoria. And another book that's been written about that, Abigail Schreier has written another book with very sound principles about gender identity. But again, she's come under huge criticism from the growing movement of transgenderism, which refuses to accept the truth of mankind's binary sex as created by God. Because remember our original principles, they don't believe in God anymore. They have postmodern views that distort from truth and falsehood, and they are governed by their feelings, how they feel at the moment. And so one day a person may feel that they're male, the next day they may feel that they're female. This is the kind of really insanity that is happening in our world today. I have another book with me today by a gentleman named Walt Heyer, who's written several books. One of them I have with me called Paper Genders, Pulling the Mask Off the Transgender Phenomenon. This man speaks to it from personal experience. He was born a man, transitioned to female, and then in recent years has transitioned back to being male after he actually had some reconstructive surgery done. And how appalling is it that we allow doctors to sexually reconstruct the sexual organs of how persons are born and remove or add sex organs? This is happening, and yet sanctioned by many doctors. And yet we have the subject of female genital mutilation, which is condemned across the world, particularly in African countries, for altering a person's sex organs, and yet the transgender movement supports literally transitioning and changing a person's sex organs. Walt Heyer went through that process and transitioned back to a man. And he ably documents all of the wrong philosophy, all of the pressure that's put on people to toe the line of transgenderism, and very capably writes about the tragic results that have occurred with transgenderism. One other person that I've failed to identify so far that is also deeply at the root of this whole thinking of gender norms, of course, is Dr. Kinsey, the famous doctor who authored the Kinsey Report and a number of volumes that basically said everything is now justified sexually. The traditional notions, Judeo-Christian notions, are to be discarded, and all manner of sexual perversion or sexual abnormality is now rationalized to be normal. These people, Dr. Kinsey, Dr. Money, Dr. Stoller, are the ones who created out of nothing the social construct that now exists in our world today, particularly around the issue of transgenderism, but also other issues that relate to the concepts of sex and gender that we see in our media every day, including LGBTQ and other ideas that are frankly moving as the most powerful lobbying group that exists in the world today, the most powerful lobby that exists in the world today. As Christians, we need to be careful to tell the truth about what is happening in our world today. And that's what we're doing in this program. And so I hope you'll continue to watch. We have a number of other topics that we'll be dealing with. Thank you for joining in with us for now.